Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helen Crowley. I'm based in the EU Centre in Pavia in Italy, and my contribution to this workshop covers a very brief summary of the 2020 European Seismic Risk Model, with a specific focus on the important data that geological science organisations across Europe provided, and which were fundamental for the development of this model. I should mention that this model was developed predominantly thanks to the SERA project, with funding from the European Union, and there was a strong collaboration throughout with the GEM Foundation. Let's dive straight into the results of the model, and then we can look at the components that are needed to develop this model and to get these results, and finally how GSOs helped shape these components. So what you're seeing here on this slide is the distribution across administrative regions of the average annual economic loss caused by damage to residential, commercial, and industrial buildings due to earthquakes in Europe. Now, the model predicts that we have an average of 7 billion euros of the built environment that is lost each year due to earthquakes, and 75% of this loss is concentrated in just 4 countries: Turkey, Italy, Romania, and Greece. We also find that 30% of the loss is coming from low-rise masonry buildings, and this is really the predominant form of construction in Europe, particularly for residential buildings. Now, if we divide that average annual loss, economic loss, by the value of the buildings, we obtain the average annual economic loss ratio. And this allows us to adjust for the varying density and value of buildings across Europe. And here we start to see a slightly different spatial variation of risk emerging. And our model tells us that on average, 0.014% of the total building stock, which we estimate has 50 trillion euros of value, that is lost again every year due to earthquakes on average. And it's the residential buildings, which are typically more vulnerable than commercial and industrial buildings, that have the highest loss ratios. Finally, if we look at the results in terms of loss of life, we find that 900 fatalities on average can be expected per year, and 90% of those fatalities are within those same 4 countries that I mentioned previously. Now, the driver of fatalities instead is the older reinforced concrete frame buildings, which don't have seismic design principles, and these buildings often house many people. We converted the many results I showed you before into a single map, and this was via a seismic risk index. And this takes the average annual economic loss and the average annual loss of life I presented previously, normalizes these quantities so that they can be combined, and then divides them by the GDP per capita to produce this risk index, which results in the map that you're seeing here. So this is one of the main products of this seismic risk model that was developed, and predominantly for communication to the public and media. So for those of you that are not familiar with how seismic risk models are developed, you can see here that there are 4 main components. And we worked on these components over a large number of years with a large number of collaborators that contributed to the SERA project and in previous projects in Europe. So the first is the seismic hazard component. This tells us where earthquakes occur, how large they can be, and how often they're going to occur. The next component that we need is to understand, given those earthquakes, what levels of ground shaking can we expect at the surface of the earth, so underneath our buildings. So this site amplification model helps us to understand how likely it is that the ground shaking, the areas where it will be higher and lower. We then have an exposure model. This is a model that describes the spatial distribution of buildings in Europe, their characteristics, and also the occupants within those buildings. And finally, we need vulnerability models that provide the probability of damage and loss, economic loss and loss of life, to the different buildings within our exposure model. And this is given as a function of the level of ground shaking. And by combining these 4 components, we can produce the wide variety of risk results that I presented previously. Now, the research studies undertaken by GSOs is of particular importance for these first 2 components. And so I've identified a couple of examples of critical data collected by European Geological Science Organizations, without which it would not have been possible for us to develop a European seismic risk model. So if we start with the seismic hazard model, the first component on the left, I think it's worth underlining that the model we now have is thanks to over 20 years of community-based modeling in Europe. And this has obviously involved a very large number of GSOs in Europe. In recent years, the data that these organizations has collected has increased significantly. And the first data set I wanted to draw your attention to is the mapped active faults. And so we have now 95,000 kilometers of mapped active faults in Europe. This active fault database is really a key component of the seismic hazard model, because active faults provide information of where earthquakes occur, how large and how often they can occur. And so since 2009, there's been a very significant effort to compile various databases and harmonize these databases into a single model that can be used for seismic hazard assessment. And so the faults that are included in these databases include crustal faults and also subduction systems. And this data is coming from a large number of contributors across Europe, and that includes GSOs. If we look forward to the next generation of European seismic hazard models, we certainly need more studies to be undertaken to collect fault databases, especially in the more silent, or let's say less seismically areas of Europe. So earlier I mentioned site amplification, which allows us to estimate the ground shaking underneath our buildings. As we're dealing with the whole of Europe, we're not able to identify in detail the soil types that are present beneath all of our buildings. So we make use of what we call proxy data sets. These are data sets that have been seen to provide a good correlation with site amplification. And geological maps is one of those proxy data sets. So here we've benefited from the activities carried out by our GSO partners in compiling a harmonized surface geology map for Europe. In order to cover all of the countries in our European seismic risk model, there are 44 countries right now, we had to combine different sources of geological mapping data. So the 3 different sources that I mentioned on this slide here. So a project called the ProMine project, the important One Geology Europe data sets, and also for Iceland, we had to go to the Icelandic Institute of Natural History to obtain the geological map there. And this allowed us, with the work of our GSO colleagues, to harmonize these data sets and produce a single map of both lithology and stratigraphy in Europe. So finally, I just wanted to touch on how I believe we can continue to ensure the involvement and sustainability of European GSOs in geohazard and risk modeling. And this is through EPOS. So those of you that are not familiar with EPOS, EPOS stands for European Plate Observing System. This is a multidisciplinary distributed research infrastructure that facilitates the integrated use of data products and facilities from the solid earth science community in Europe. It has been supported with funding from the European Commission, and it now has 17 member countries that pay annual subscriptions. So the European seismic hazard and risk models that I've been presenting today, they are part of the EPOS seismology community. So this is the earthquake community of EPOS. And these models will be continued to be maintained and developed under this umbrella. So within EPOS, under the EPOS seismology community, funding arrives to ensure that these models continue to be maintained and further improved. Also within EPOS, there is a scientific community focused on geological information and modeling. And so this consolidates geological and borehole information available via the Eurogeo surveys. So Eurogeo surveys is a not-for-profit organization representing all of the geologicals, or a large number of geological surveys of Europe. So we have made use of this data and services coming from the geological information and modeling community for our European seismic hazard and risk models. And I look forward to an even better integration between the data and services provided by these 2 communities in the future. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. I only had 10 minutes, so I could only give a very brief overview of the seismic hazard and risk models. But if you'd like further information, then I invite you to visit the AFAIR website at this link here on the last slide. Thank you.